Before I resume reading right where I left off, I feel the need to first explain in part one, when there was raised my voice, it wasn't to emphasize anything other than there were blaring fire sirens going by in a fire truck, so I raised my voice to speak over the sirens. Now, modern telephones in this day and age have a really good microphone, and apparently they were able to, in the playback, I didn't hear any sirens, but at the time I was speaking, that's really all I could hear unless I raised my voice. But anyhow, with that being said, I'll pick up right where I left off. Bumpily lumpily at 6 miles per hour. Whilst I utilized my hazard flashers to alert myself to fellow drivers across a distance of about 1.5 miles to this new location I had previously scouted out on foot. It is factual to note that I scouted out this spot prior to winding up in the church parking lot due to having made a wrong turn on Thursday the 13th of July. With that clarification, I hope that you can follow along as we skip back in time to June 22nd, when I departed from Proctorville, Ohio, en route to Prestonburg, Kentucky. I didn't have high expectations for what sort of library I might find in Prestonburg, but given the fact that it is the county seat of Floyd County, I was confident that it would have a library. I was pleased to discover that Prestonburg is the location of Big Sandy Community College, and upon that campus there was a sizable library. However, I arrived at the campus before library hours, whereas I had left Proctorville in pre-dawn hour. My hope for this library was in the gaining of at least the location of the unincorporated community of Burton, which was discoverable on Google Maps, but not marked on the official state road map of Kentucky, which I acquired from an interstate welcome center in December of 2021. I've come to distrust the use of Google Maps driving directions due to events I shall not detail at this time, but surmise it to say I had been gravely misled in the relatively recent past, and I use the word gravely in a sense that if I had followed it, it would have led to a watery grave for at least the vehicle I was piloting. I have somewhat confidence in myself that even if I had followed its directions to make a blind right, which was not a roadway but in fact a boat ramp into the Cheat Lake, I still would have found a way to escape the vehicle and avoid peril. Having stated that factual occurrence, I feel a need to remove any direct accusation against Google Corporation for this occurrence, for I suspect this happened via cyber hack of a third-party entity. So my distrust is not directly towards Google Maps, but verily towards my access to reliable data. As I parked my Kia in front of a parking lot of Big Sandy Community College, I decided to exit the vehicle and have a look around to find the library entrance. In the parking lot, I met a friendly maintenance man who directed me to the library, but alerted me to the time of which it would be open, for that was yet another hour. Sensing his own want for conversation, driven by friendly curiosity towards myself, I began to inform him of why I had come. I explained to him that I had a nocturnal dream in the winter months of the first part of the year of 2020, in which Donald Rumsfeld had pointed to a map of Kentucky and pinpointed a spot labeled Burton. After later discovering verification that indeed such location does or did exist, I placed a certain special importance on this dream and viewed a document I acquired in 2013 with new light. This document I found in 2013 whilst researching my genealogy came via Boone Family Alliances, a .org website. The header read Burton of West Virginia, Virginia, and Kentucky. It then begins upon naming the patriarchal ancestor of Burton to be one Rufus, who used the alias of Rufus Gollaher and William Rufus. The authors of this document state their own belief of whom Rufus' ancestors may have been, but admit in declaration that this assumption had been derived via merely circumstantial evidence without stating precisely what circumstantial evidence it was based. It does state that it was known fact to themselves that Rufus and some of his sons worked for the railroad. It goes on to detail the descendants of Rufus via two separate marriages. His second wife, one Sarah Cromwell, daughter of Andrew Cromwell and Morning McCoy, gave birth to a son in 1900 named him Sherman Dewey Burton. The name my father shares with his own father. Reading between the lines, I deduced that this document's authors had not access to a birth certificate for Rufus. Rather, instead, documents associated with his work records, his marriage certificates, and birth certificates of his descendants. Therefore, the birth year assigned to Rufus as 1858 was most likely derived based upon what age Rufus gave when seeking employment on the railroad. Having learned directly from my grandfather, Robert Frederick Combs, the father of my mother, that he himself gave the age of 18 when he in fact was 16 in order to join the Army in 1942 in order to participate in World War II, I find it reasonable to believe that Rufus could possibly have done likewise with the railroad company, whom I doubt would be more thorough or restrictive than the United States Army in regards to accepting data given by a young man seeking participation. Therefore, I suggest it is not unlikely that Rufus may have been born in 1860. This year of 1860 being important because it is the year in which one Sir Richard Francis Burton of England visited the United States with a traveling companion who so happened to be a doctor. In a biography written by Edward Rice, it is declared that much mystery surrounds the intent of this voyage that sprung forth unexpectedly very soon after a marriage was refused to him of one Lady Isabel, due to reported disapproval of her mother. It quotes, however, a journal entry by Sir Richard that a woman with a glow about her was sitting opposite of him during the sea voyage to America. It goes on to tell that after landing on this continent, Richard and his traveling companion headed south to Washington, D.C., where he met with John Floyd, who was Secretary of War at the time, a position which was later retitled Secretary of Defense, the position Donald Rumsfeld held, whereas he reportedly sought battlefronts of conflict with North American Indians. Now, it cannot go without being stated that Sir Richard had already written numerous detailed accounts of all his travels to India, North Africa, and the Middle East. Whereas the lack of detail in this particular voyage stood out as mysterious to author Edward Rice and author-investigator Walter Bosley. After about a month, Sir Richard's normal detailed chronicling of his travels resumed as he began westward travel in St. Louis, Missouri, with the doctor no longer among his company, an account which would later be published as City of the Saints, detailing his travel to and time visiting Salt Lake City, where he met with one Brigham Young. Given all these facts, and inspired by mysterious lack of documentation of certain important facts, I felt compelled by my own curiosity and search for origin, in this case quite personal. I have fashioned my own theory by connecting the dots and reading between the lines. I have come to believe that Rufus was indeed the son of Sir Richard Francis Burton, who was brought either in the womb or perhaps as a newborn within the arms of his mother, who with Richard conceived him out of wedlock, the most notorious and reprehensible deed for those of high reputation in those times, which I can state with confidence and verification of proof. What I can state with confidence and verification of proof is that I am the great-grandson of Rufus Burton. My father's name, Sherman Dewey, which was passed on to him by his father, who was born in 1900, I deduced to be derived from Admiral Dewey, who was quite the celebrity in 1900, and from General Sherman, who held similar fame in the second half of the 19th century. Thus it was with these beliefs and knowledge gained through previous research and even spiritual compulsion via the nocturnal dream, I stood now in conversation with this maintenance man who just heard spoken in less formal words and mannerisms common to our shared Appalachian upbringing. I was pleased that his response was not one of doubtfulness, and that instead he shared with me some of his own genealogy, which included the 7-foot-tall Indian chief Tecumseh. This triggered my response to switch track and state that remains of high vertical stature appeared to be common in remains of the so-called Indian mounds. I was mindful to not go as far as to state that I had read accounts of these remains having been up to 14 feet in height, and thus declared to be giants, whereas I wished not to come off as a wingnut. But it was he, not I, who went out on that limb and recounted to me that even our honored former president, Abraham Lincoln, spoke of giants while giving a speech at Niagara Falls. He went on to state his belief that an orchestrated cover-up of these facts has been carried out, and he named the Smithsonian Institute as the prime culprits. Sensing his own look upon this matter to supersede my own, I asked, "Why do you think they would want to do that?" He replied, "Because it blows the theory of evolution out of the water." With a respectful nod to one another, signifying at least good conversation and at optimum an acknowledgement of brotherhood between fellow believers against the standard model of origins of our species, we parted ways, and I walked about a bit until the library opened. Oh, but I forgot to mention one other detail about that conversation. As he wished me luck in learning more about my family history, he felt it important to warn me that he and others had, a couple years prior, been ordered to dispose of a great number of old books from that Big Sandy College library on account of supposed dangerous mildew amongst the pages, which he spoke with a tone that noted his doubtfulness of the given reason for this destruction. Therefore, they had been sent away under the assumption that they were headed to the landfill. Yet with all his knowledge and curiosity of history, he was not familiar with a community named Burton to exist in that county. Once inside the library, I acquainted myself with 3 female librarians on duty. They too were most welcoming and hospitable, yet also knew nothing of Burton. One of them, however, was perked of interest by my mention of the last name McCoy. She suggested that I watch a television miniseries about the Battle of the Hatfields and McCoys, which took place not far from where we were and along that same Big Sandy River. I replied that I may indeed do that at some point, but politely redirected the conversation back towards finding the location of Burton. They were very helpful in finding what resources they might have, which amounted to 1 book of Kentucky town names and a book of old maps. The book of town names told of a former post office titled Burton, but it was not in Floyd County. However, the book of old maps clearly marked the landmass in the southern part of Floyd County as Burton. The friendly ladies opened up a special research room to allow me utmost privilege and undistracted opportunity to view these documents until I was satisfied that I had gained enough direction as to continue on with my search for Burton. I re-entered the main area of the library with the maps book open to the useful pages, and they made copies for me of those pages for the small price of copier use. One of them was knowledgeable of the county roadways enough that she was able to give me directions verbally of how to drive to the approximate locale. So it was that I headed southward from Prestonburg following her direction until I felt myself to be quite near. I entered a gas station of the smallest form where I bought gas, but also inquired as to whether or not they knew of a place called Burton. They were very familiar with it and explained what sort of things I would espy to indicate my arrival, noting that I would not see any road signs that would make it known. They told me of a hardware store where an old man worked and stated that it was the center of Burton, and said the old man would probably be the most useful historian in that area to converse with. They declared I was only a couple miles away from this hardware store, and so I resumed travel. Being as the gas station had no public restroom, I drove only a mile or so before I stopped, as I spotted an area to park and walk away the roadway to not be seen as to take a leak. It so happened that I walked to the base of a small rock cliff. After relieving myself, I looked up the cliff and spotted old worn markings. One of them was rather clear, and it was a mathematical symbol for pi. Other markings appeared to have been engraven, later intentionally chiseled to unclarify, and appeared to me that indeed it had once been the letters to spell Burton. Having not yet come to the hardware store, I continued my southward route of driving until I came to the hardware store, but elected to drive past it in order to first find the southern boundary of this community. A short distance south of the hardware store, I spotted a road sign obstructed of viewing by tree limbs. So I pulled the car over and took a closer look. The sign said Lower Burton. I found a place to park the car on the roadway and then walked down the road marked Lower Burton, which was on the westward side of the main road, and descended towards a grouping of houses I would term as a village. While walking around this small village of 20 or 30 homes, I noted that most appeared to have been built in the last 50 years, and they were all single-story in height. But one, which sat in its midst, was 2-story in height and much older, while the others were built around it. While walking the village, I encountered a lady on a porch who knew nothing of the community's history, a pack of free-roaming dogs, and a group of young men who also knew nothing of the community's history, but informed me that they had come down from Maryland to, quote, fix it up. I ascended back out of the village on a different road than the Lower Burton road I'd come down. When I reached the main road, I saw a street sign bent over. There beside it, in the weeds, I found the damaged remains of a fiberplastic sign that read Burton Hill. At this point, I walked back to the Kia and then drove back to the hardware store, which I'd been informed was the center of Burton, and asked the old man what he knew of the town's history. That his hardware store is officially in Belleville, though his hardware store is officially in Belleville, misspelled quite likely, and that what he knew of this town's history was that a construction company named Burton Construction came there and built that community from elsewhere. I replied to him by relating to him my belief of Burton having been settled with at least one homestead. I believe that old house which stands in its midst in the later half of the 1800s, to which he replied, I do know that it was called Burton before that construction company came into town. Sensing the old man game for a story, I told him all about Richard Francis and Rufus, and how Richard could never have been Sir, nor Isabel, whom suddenly gained approval for her family for marriage after his trip to America, had it been known of a child born out of wedlock deposited here in Appalachian America. Therefore, lest it be known that the Queen of England made a mistake in the knighting of Richard, it had seemed more convenient to take measures to cover it up and, if possible, erase my family lineage from history. The old man smiled throughout my telling, not with mockery, but with enjoyment. I then headed back northward with this experience in mind and the remains of the signed Burton Hill now in my possession. My next sub-destination for this quest I chose to be Grayville, Illinois. Whereas Grayville had a cannabis dispensary and Illinois had legalized recreational marijuana. So after going north, I headed west. I'm not presently disposed to a road map. I can't say for sure the exact route, but I can recall a length of road, approximately 100 miles, that was the Burt T. Combs Highway, and that